Have you ever had that moment where something inside you just snaps? Not in anger, but in clarity. That moment when you suddenly realize that the way people have been treating you, the way you've been allowing yourself to be treated, is completely unacceptable. It's as if a veil has been lifted from your eyes, and for the first time, you see your own worth with crystal clear vision. Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist who revolutionized our understanding of the human psyche, called this moment a critical threshold in psychological development. He understood that there comes a pivotal point in every person's life when they must choose between continuing to live as a victim of others' projections and stepping into their authentic power. But here's what Jung discovered that most people never realize. This moment of recognizing your worth as non-negotiable isn't just a personal breakthrough. It's a complete restructuring of your psychological architecture, a fundamental shift that ripples through every aspect of your existence. In the next few minutes, I'm going to share with you the 5 unmistakable signs that you've reached this transformative threshold, the psychological mechanisms that Jung identified as being responsible for keeping us trapped in cycles of self-devaluation. And most importantly, what happens to your life when you finally make the conscious decision that your worth is no longer up for debate. This isn't just about building self-esteem or learning to be more assertive. This is about understanding the profound psychological and spiritual transformation that occurs when you align with what Jung called your authentic self, with a capital S. The first sign that you've reached this crucial turning point is what I call the end of the explanation addiction. For years, maybe decades, you found yourself constantly justifying your decisions, your feelings, your very existence to others. Why did you choose that career? Why don't you want to attend that family gathering? Why do you prefer solitude over social events? Jung understood that this compulsive need to explain ourselves stems from what he termed the collective unconscious pressure to conform to societal expectations. We internalize these external voices so completely that we begin to believe our worth depends on other people's understanding and approval of our choices. But when you truly recognize your worth as non-negotiable, something profound shifts. You stop feeling the need to defend your reality to people who have no business judging it. This isn't about becoming defensive or closed off. It's about developing what Jung called psychological sovereignty. You understand that your inner knowing, your authentic preferences, your intuitive responses to life are valid simply because they're yours. The person who has reached this threshold might say something like, "I've decided not to participate in that project," without feeling compelled to provide a dissertation on their reasoning. They've internalized the profound truth that their choices don't require external validation to be legitimate. This shift represents what Jung identified as a movement from the ego's desperate need for approval to the self's inherent knowing of its own value. The ego, in Jung's framework, is that part of us that's constantly seeking validation from the outside world. But the self, our deeper authentic nature, doesn't need anyone's permission to exist or to make choices that align with its truth. The second sign is the mysterious disappearance of energy vampires from your life. Jung was fascinated by the concept of psychological projection, the unconscious process by which we attract people and situations that mirror our internal state. When we don't value ourselves, when our sense of worth is constantly up for negotiation, we unconsciously broadcast this uncertainty to the world. And the world, in its perfect reflective nature, sends us people who will treat us exactly as we treat ourselves. But here's what's remarkable. When you make the internal shift to recognizing your worth as non-negotiable, you literally change your energetic frequency. Jung understood that our psychological state creates what he called a psychic field around us. People who are used to taking advantage of your flexible boundaries, who have grown accustomed to your endless availability and accommodation, suddenly find themselves unable to access you in the same way. It's not that you're actively pushing them away, it's that your energy no longer matches their need for someone who will constantly bend to their will. I remember reading about a woman who had spent years being the go-to person for everyone's problems, the one who would drop everything to help others, often at the expense of her own well-being. She described the moment she realized her worth wasn't negotiable as feeling like she had installed invisible but impenetrable boundaries around herself. Suddenly, the friend who only called when she needed something stopped calling altogether. The family member who had grown used to her limitless availability began seeking help elsewhere. This wasn't because she became cold or uncaring, but because her energy no longer vibrated at the frequency of someone whose worth was conditional. This phenomenon points to what Jung called the law of psychological resonance. We attract what matches our internal state. When your worth becomes non-negotiable internally, the external world has no choice but to respond to this new frequency. The third sign is perhaps the most liberating, the death of people-pleasing. Jung understood that people-pleasing isn't kindness, it's a sophisticated survival mechanism developed by the ego to ensure safety and acceptance. The people-pleaser has learned, often in childhood, that their worth is directly tied to how much they can give, how much they can accommodate, how small they can make themselves to avoid conflict or rejection. But when you reach the threshold of non-negotiable self-worth, you begin to understand what Jung called the difference between genuine compassion and unconscious self-sacrifice. Genuine compassion comes from a place of overflow, from a cup that's already full. Unconscious self-sacrifice comes from a place of emptiness, from the desperate hope that if we give enough of ourselves away, someone will finally deem us worthy of love. The person who has recognized their worth as non-negotiable begins to say no without guilt, not because they don't care about others, but because they understand that saying yes from a place of resentment or obligation serves no one. They've learned what Jung called the art of conscious choice. Every yes becomes meaningful because it's not given out of fear or compulsion, but out of genuine desire and alignment. This shift often creates what Jung termed therapeutic discomfort in the people around you. Those who have grown accustomed to your endless accommodation may initially react with confusion, anger, or attempts to guilt you back into your old patterns. This is because your change threatens their psychological comfort zone. They've organized their own behavior around your predictable responses, and your newfound boundaries force them to confront their own patterns of taking without giving. The fourth sign is the emergence of what I call selective availability. Jung wrote extensively about the concept of psychological energy and how we distribute it. He understood that we have a finite amount of psychic energy each day, and how we choose to invest this energy directly impacts our psychological well-being and spiritual development. When your worth becomes non-negotiable, you begin to treat your time, attention, and energy as the precious resources they actually are. You stop being available to every request, every crisis, every demand for your attention. This isn't selfishness. It's what Jung called psychological hygiene. You begin to understand that your presence is a gift, not an entitlement. This selective availability often manifests in subtle but profound ways. You might find yourself no longer immediately responding to every text message or email. You might discover that you're no longer willing to engage in conversations that drain your energy or serve no constructive purpose. You become what Jung called consciously choosy about where you direct your precious life force. People in your life may initially interpret this as you becoming distant or difficult, but what's actually happening is that you're moving from unconscious reactivity to conscious responsiveness. You're no longer allowing other people's urgency to become your emergency. You're no longer allowing other people's inability to manage their own emotions to dictate your emotional state. This shift represents what Jung identified as a movement from collective unconsciousness to individual consciousness. Instead of automatically responding to social pressure and expectations, you begin to respond from your own center, your own sense of what's appropriate and necessary. The fifth sign is perhaps the most profound, the integration of your shadow. Jung spent much of his career exploring what he called the shadow, those aspects of ourselves that we've rejected, repressed, or deemed unacceptable. For people who struggle with self-worth, the shadow often contains qualities like anger, selfishness, ambition, or the desire for recognition. We've learned to suppress these natural human emotions and drives because we fear they make us unlovable. But when you recognize your worth as non-negotiable, you begin to reclaim these disowned parts of yourself. You begin to understand that your anger might be pointing toward important boundaries that need to be set. Your so-called selfishness might actually be healthy self-care. Your ambition might be the fuel that drives you toward your authentic purpose. This integration doesn't mean becoming cruel or narcissistic. It means becoming whole. Jung understood that psychological health requires us to acknowledge and integrate all aspects of our nature, not just the ones that others find palatable. When you stop trying to be the perfect, accommodating version of yourself that others expect, you free up enormous amounts of psychic energy that can be redirected toward authentic self-expression and genuine contribution to the world. The person who has integrated their shadow no longer apologizes for taking up space. They no longer minimize their achievements or downplay their needs. They've learned what Jung called the art of appropriate selfishness, understanding that you cannot give from an empty cup, and that honoring your own needs actually enables you to show up more fully for others. Before we continue, I want to pause here and acknowledge something important. If you're finding value in this exploration of Jung's insights about self-worth and psychological transformation, it means you're ready for this level of inner work. Consider subscribing to this channel and sharing this content with others who might benefit from these perspectives. The journey of individuation, as Jung called it, is deeply personal. But it's also something that ripples out to benefit our entire community. Your decision to value yourself appropriately gives others permission to do the same. Now let's explore what Jung discovered about the psychological mechanisms that keep us trapped in cycles of self-devaluation. Understanding these patterns is crucial because awareness is the first step toward transformation. Jung identified what he called the approval addiction as one of the most insidious barriers to recognizing our inherent worth. This addiction develops early in life when we learn that love and acceptance are conditional upon our behavior, our achievements, our ability to meet others' expectations. The child learns that they are valued not for who they are, but for what they do, how they perform, how well they can anticipate and meet the needs of the adults around them. This early conditioning creates what Jung termed a false self-structure. We develop an elaborate persona, a mask that we present to the world designed to maximize approval and minimize rejection. Over time, we become so identified with this persona that we lose touch with our authentic nature. Our worth becomes entirely dependent on external validation, creating a psychological prison where we're constantly performing for an audience that can never be fully satisfied. The tragedy of this pattern is that it's self-perpetuating. The more we seek validation from others, the more we reinforce the belief that our worth is not inherent but must be earned. We become trapped in what Jung called the complex of inadequacy, a psychological pattern where we constantly measure ourselves against external standards and inevitably find ourselves wanting. But Jung also discovered something remarkable. This pattern can be broken. The key lies in what he called the development of the inner witness, a part of our psyche that can observe our patterns without being caught up in them. This witness begins to notice when we're giving our power away, when we're seeking approval at the expense of our authenticity, when we're treating our worth as something that can be negotiated rather than something that simply is. The development of this inner witness is closely connected to what Jung called the process of individuation. Individuation is the psychological process by which we become who we truly are, distinct from both our conditioning and the collective expectations of society. It's the process by which we learn to value our own inner compass above the opinions and expectations of others. Jung understood that this process often involves what he called a confrontation with the unconscious. We must face the parts of ourselves that we've hidden away, the needs we've denied, the dreams we've abandoned in service of others' comfort. This confrontation can be uncomfortable, even painful, but it's absolutely necessary for psychological wholeness. One of the most challenging aspects of this process is learning to disappoint others consciously. Jung recognized that for most people, the fear of disappointing others is so strong that they'll sacrifice their own authenticity to avoid it. But he also understood that this pattern inevitably leads to what he called psychological death, a state where we become so disconnected from our true nature that we feel empty, resentful, and spiritually bankrupt. The person who has learned to make their worth non-negotiable has developed what Jung called the courage to be disliked. They understand that attempting to be everything to everyone means being nothing to themselves. They've learned that some people will inevitably be disappointed by their authentic choices, and they've made peace with this reality. This doesn't mean becoming callous or indifferent to others' feelings. It means understanding that your primary responsibility is to your own psychological health and spiritual development. Jung believed that when we're operating from this centered place, we actually become more genuinely helpful to others, not less. We can offer authentic support and compassion rather than the resentful accommodation that comes from people-pleasing. Now let's explore what Jung called the anima and animus, and how these concepts relate to the recognition of non-negotiable self-worth. In Jung's psychology, the anima represents the feminine aspect within men, while the animus represents the masculine aspect within women. But more broadly, these concepts represent the contrasexual aspects of our psyche that we often project onto others rather than integrating within ourselves. Many people who struggle with self-worth are actually struggling with what Jung called anima-animus possession. They've projected their own power, their own capacity for decisiveness, their own inner authority onto others. A woman might consistently seek strong male figures to make decisions for her, while a man might look to women to provide the emotional validation he cannot give himself. But when your worth becomes non-negotiable, you begin to reclaim these projected aspects of yourself. You no longer need someone else to validate your decisions or provide your sense of power. You've integrated what Jung called the inner marriage, the union of your own masculine and feminine aspects, your own capacity for both strength and receptivity, both action and intuition. This integration is often experienced as a profound sense of psychological completion. You no longer feel like half a person seeking your other half. You feel whole, complete, capable of both giving and receiving love without losing yourself in the process. Jung also wrote extensively about what he called the collective shadow, those aspects of human nature that society as a whole has deemed unacceptable. In many cultures, qualities like assertiveness, boundary setting, and self-advocacy are part of this collective shadow, especially for women. We're taught that these qualities are selfish, unfeminine, or socially disruptive. But when you recognize your worth as non-negotiable, you begin to reclaim these shadowed qualities. You understand that assertiveness is not aggression, that boundary setting is not meanness, that self-advocacy is not selfishness. You begin to embody what Jung called conscious wholeness, integrating all aspects of your nature, rather than rejecting those that don't fit societal expectations. This process often involves what Jung termed moral courage, the willingness to stand for your values even when others don't understand or support them. It requires what he called psychological differentiation, the ability to distinguish between what belongs to you and what belongs to others, between your responsibilities and their responsibilities, between your emotions and their emotions. The person who has developed this level of psychological differentiation no longer takes responsibility for other people's emotional reactions. They understand that while they should be considerate and respectful, they cannot control how others choose to respond to their authentic self-expression. This understanding is incredibly liberating because it frees up the enormous amount of energy that was previously spent trying to manage others' feelings. Jung believed that this kind of psychological development wasn't just beneficial for the individual, but was actually a service to humanity. He understood that when we operate from authentic self-worth rather than neurotic people-pleasing, we contribute to what he called the elevation of collective consciousness. Our willingness to be authentic gives others permission to be authentic as well. But perhaps the most profound aspect of recognizing your worth as non-negotiable is what Jung called the development of transpersonal perspective. This is the understanding that your worth isn't dependent on any external circumstance because it's rooted in something deeper than your individual personality or achievements. Jung spent considerable time exploring what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to bridge the gap between conscious and unconscious, between individual and universal, between temporal and eternal. When your sense of worth is rooted in this deeper dimension of being, it becomes truly unshakable because it's not dependent on anything that can be taken away from you. This doesn't mean developing spiritual bypassing or denying the practical realities of life. It means understanding that while circumstances may change, while relationships may end, while careers may shift, there's something essential about your being that remains constant and valuable regardless of external conditions. The person who has reached this level of understanding has what Jung called religious attitude, not necessarily in the conventional sense, but in the sense of being connected to something sacred within themselves. They've discovered what he called the inner temple, a space of inherent worth and dignity that no external circumstance can violate. This inner knowing manifests in countless small but significant ways. You stop apologizing for your existence, for taking up space, for having needs and preferences. You stop seeking permission to be yourself. You stop allowing others to define your value or dictate your choices. You become what Jung called a conscious individual, someone who operates from their own center rather than being constantly blown about by the winds of social opinion. Now here's what Jung discovered that most people never realize about this transformation. It's not a destination, but an ongoing process. The recognition that your worth is non-negotiable isn't something you achieve once and then never have to think about again. It's a continuous practice of returning to your center, of remembering your inherent value when the world tries to convince you otherwise. Jung understood that we live in what he called a collectivized society, that profits from our insecurity, that benefits from our constant striving for external validation. Every advertisement, every social media post, every cultural message is designed to make us feel inadequate so that we'll buy something, do something, or become something in order to feel worthy. But the person who has internalized their non-negotiable worth becomes immune to these manipulations. They've developed what Jung called psychological immunity to the collective neurosis of our culture. They can appreciate beauty, strive for excellence, and enjoy material pleasures without needing these things to define their value. This immunity isn't about becoming disconnected from the world, but about engaging with it from a place of fullness rather than emptiness, from confidence rather than desperation, from love rather than fear. Jung believed that this kind of centered engagement was not only healthier for the individual, but was actually what the world most needed from each of us. The ultimate revelation that Jung discovered about non-negotiable self-worth is this: It's not really about you at all. When you truly recognize your inherent value, you simultaneously recognize the inherent value of all beings. Your worth isn't special because it's yours. It's special because all worth is special. You're valuable not because you're different from others, but because you're connected to the same source of being that makes all life sacred. This understanding eliminates what Jung called neurotic competition, the exhausting game of trying to prove that you're more worthy than others. Instead, it cultivates what he called conscious cooperation, the recognition that we're all expressions of the same fundamental life force, each valuable in our own unique way. When you operate from this understanding, you stop trying to diminish others to elevate yourself. You stop seeking to win at others' expense. You begin to understand that in the deepest sense, we're all on the same team, all struggling with the same fundamental challenges of being human, all deserving of compassion and respect. This shift in perspective transforms not only how you see yourself, but how you see everyone around you. You begin to recognize the wounded child in the controlling boss, the frightened soul beneath the aggressive neighbor, the desperate need for love behind the manipulative behavior of difficult people. This doesn't mean you accept abuse or fail to maintain boundaries, but it means you can hold both compassion and firmness, both understanding and discernment. Jung called this the development of wise compassion, the ability to see clearly without losing your heart, to maintain boundaries without losing your humanity, to stand in your power without diminishing others. This is perhaps the greatest gift that comes from recognizing your worth as non-negotiable. It frees you to love more fully because you're no longer desperately seeking love to fill an inner void. As we conclude this exploration, I want to leave you with Jung's most powerful insight about self-worth. It's not something you have to create or earn or prove. It's something you have to remember. Somewhere beneath all the conditioning, beneath all the wounds, beneath all the stories about why you're not enough, there's a place in you that has always known your value. Jung called this place the self with a capital S, the divine spark that exists at the core of your being. The moment you realize your worth is non-negotiable isn't the moment you become worthy. It's the moment you remember that you always were worthy, that you came into this world as a perfect expression of life itself, that no amount of rejection or criticism or failure could ever diminish the fundamental miracle of your existence. This remembering is what Jung called the greatest achievement of human consciousness, not the accumulation of external success or validation, but the recognition of what was always already true. You are valuable not because of what you do or what you have or what others think of you, but because you are. Your worth is written into the very fabric of your being, as inherent and unchangeable as the laws of physics. The invitation now is not to become someone worthy of love and respect, but to align your life with the truth of your inherent worth. To make choices from this place of inner knowing rather than from the desperate seeking of external validation. To treat yourself and others as the sacred beings you all are, to live from the understanding that your worth was never up for debate in the first place. This is the path that Jung called individuation, not the creation of a worthy self, but the discovery of the worthy self that has been there all along, waiting patiently beneath the layers of conditioning and fear, ready to emerge into the light of conscious recognition. The moment you realize your worth isn't negotiable is the moment you begin to live from this deeper truth. And in doing so, you give everyone around you permission to remember their own inherent value as well.